What are some government secrets that have been declassified that most people still don't know about? The cat bomb. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services decided that the best way to ensure that their bombs reached the intended naval targets was to strap them to cats and drop the cats from planes with parachutes. It was believed that the cats would naturally avoid the water and direct their payload to enemy decks. The project was declared a failure because no way was found to stop the cats from fainting in midair. Story 2. The U.S. caused the death of the world's first commercial satellite, Telstar, only a few months after it was launched. We set off a nuclear blast in space, 5 actually, and that blast, Starfish Prime, created an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, that Telstar, which was placed in orbit the day after the test. The EMP effects energized the Earth's magnetic field ion enough to cause the satellite to die on orbit. The government didn't tell AT&T what happened until around 2005 or so. Whoops, our bad. Sorry. Story 3. Wireless transmission of audible voices into the skulls of human beings, accomplished decades ago. Glimpses of weapons based on this technology have been uploaded and quickly pulled down from military websites. The Army calls it V2K for voice to skull, also referred to as voice of God weapon. Abu Zubaydah, SP, was waterboarded IIRC 83 times, but that didn't get him talking. What did was a visitation in his cell from Allah, who spoke to him and told him his cooperation would make things easier on the brothers. He was able to withstand the waterboarding for quite some time, and by that I mean probably 30 to 35 seconds, and a short time afterwards, in the next day or so, he told his interrogator that Allah had visited him in his cell during the night and told him to cooperate. Eventually, it was reported that Abu Zubaydah had been waterboarded at least 83 times. Story 4. By the time the public knew about the SR-71, it was old technology. The aircraft was so fast that the standard operating procedure for missile evasion was too accurate. None have ever been shot down. Whatever replaced it is better. Story 5. There are a number of secrets from World War II and after that have been declassified, yet few know about. Most involves things like troop movements, etc. It may seem weird to only declassify them decades later, but the fact that military doctrine changes very slowly and even something as simple as a janitorial supply list can give a good estimate of the number of personnel in the area. Story 6. After World War II, the United States gave immunity to Shiro Ishii, the Japanese Army medical officer responsible for lethal human experimentation and biological warfare projects. He performed so many horrible acts on POWs in Unit 731 just to see what would happen. Seriously. His unit conducted psychological experiments on human subjects, including vivisections, forced abortions, and simulated strokes, heart attacks, frostbite, and hypothermia. American scientists decided this information was invaluable and he was never tried for his crimes. He was given immunity in exchange for his information on chemical and biological warfare. Story 7. We up the Castle Bravo test. For those of you who don't know, the Castle Bravo test was the largest nuclear explosion ever produced by the United States. The short and sweet is that we packed the explosive components in with a bunch of benign substance. The benign substance was an isotope of the explosive, so the ratio was like 60% of the active element and 40% inactive. We didn't know that if you blast the inactive isotope with enough energy, it transforms itself into the active isotope. We made the explosion much bigger than intended, and it almost killed the skeleton crew in the observation bunker. We estimated beforehand that the explosion would be somewhere in between 4 megatons and 8 megatons, 8 being the scary, big end of the spectrum. It was 15 frickin' megatons. Story 8. From some flying magazine. The SR-71 was introduced in 1966, at a time in which commercial aircraft were pretty much limited to 25 to 30,000 feet altitude maximum. There was a very junior air traffic controller bored out of his mind, minding an ATC center somewhere in the heartland. Now, he frequently handled unscheduled changes in altitude. Pilots would call them in and he'd routinely grant the change. This evening, he gets a call. Northfield ATC, this is Rainbird 27 requesting altitude 50,000. Controller. Okay, Rainbird 27, if you can get up to 50K, you can have it. Rainbird 27, roger that. Descending to 50K. Thanks and good night. Story 9. Project Thors. Project Thor is an idea for a weapons system that launches kinetic projectiles from Earth's orbit to damage targets on the ground. Jerry Pornelli originated the concept while working in operations research at Boeing in the 1950s before becoming a science fiction writer. The system most often described is an orbiting tungsten telephone pole with small fins and computer in the back for guidance. The system described in the 2003 United States Air Force report was that of 20 foot long, 6.1 meters, 1 foot diameter, 0.30 meters, tungsten rods that are satellite controlled and have global strike capability with impact speeds of Mach 10. The time between deorbiting and impact would be only a few minutes, and depending on orbits and positions in the orbits, the system would have a worldwide range. There is no requirement to deploy missiles, aircraft, or other vehicles. Although the SALT II 1979 prohibited the deployment of orbital weapons of mass destruction, it did not prohibit the deployment of conventional weapons. The system is prohibited by either the Outer Space Treaty or the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Some systems are quoted as having the yield of a small tactical nuclear bomb. Story 10. Project MK Ultra. During the Cold War, the CIA initiated Project MK Ultra, a secret and illegal human research program to investigate potential mind control systems. The program's operators examined the effects of hypnosis, biological agents, and drugs such as LSD and barbiturates on human subjects. Some historians suggest the program was designed to develop a mind control system that could be used to program the brains of potential assassins. Story 11. What crashed in Roswell was declassified in the early 90s. It was a cluster of balloons being developed to listen for nuclear detonations. There's a layer in the atmosphere where a loud enough sound can actually carry around the world. The project became pointless before it was completed by the invention of satellites. Story 12. The United States supported the brutal dictator Pinochet, assassinated Colonel Schneider, and trained DINA, Chilean intelligence/paramilitary group that committed human rights abuses including disappearances and torture. Nixon and Kissinger damaged Chile's economy in order to destabilize the country, creating a cope climate. These files have been declassified and you can read them all in the Pinochet file. Story 13. My grandma worked in Bletchley Park during World War II, deciphering messages, including one that supposedly cut the war short by about 6 months. I know a lot of it is already known, but not much was actually declassified yet, and not half as interesting/fucked up as some of these, but they wouldn't even acknowledge she worked there until 6 years ago. Even then, it was just someone from the MOD knocking on her door unannounced and handing her a medal. She died a few years ago and never really spoke of what she did there. Story 14. I'm really surprised this isn't on the list. Nixon committed treason. In the run-up to the '68 election, he engineered it so that the Vietnamese government wouldn't accept the ceasefire that Johnson had negotiated. Even George Will concedes that the proof is incontrovertible. Story 15. In the early 1960s, an experimental nuclear reactor developed for the Army exploded in the Idaho desert, killing 3 technicians. Their bodies were so badly radiated they had to be buried in lead-lined coffins. The body of the man who was most likely the prompt critical event wasn't found for quite some time. It wasn't until the emergency crews were able to look up. At the roof of the containment building where the reactor exploded did they find him, impaled by the control rod that he accidentally withdrew too far. Story 16. Area 51 was/is an experimental airbase. The reason they guard it so closely isn't because of aliens, but rather that it's the place we test very sensitive aircraft and similar things that have the potential to change warfare to a fundamental level. The SR-71 was developed there and tested many times. We also tried to develop a flying saucer. There's a video that shows someone driving a floating circular disc that Hitler had also tried to develop. They didn't go through with it because the scientists decided that the time would be wasted to try to make an actual high altitude one. They declassified this a good bit ago, but people are too focused on the alien aspect that they don't care. Personally, I think the government would go to these extremes for technology that allows us to spy on our enemies/allies almost undetected much faster than they would for a little green dude. Story 17. Most people by now know about the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where we continued to withhold the cure for decades after its discovery because we wanted to see the study through its completion, aka until all the black men. However, in the 1940s, the doctors running the experiment purposefully infected soldiers, prostitutes, and orphans in Guatemala, only 26% of whom were treated. Generations later, the syphilis experiments conducted by the U.S. government doctors continued to ruin lives there. Story 17. CIA had a stealth helicopter in Vietnam that was used for a handful of covert wiretapping missions that necessitated complete silence in order to avoid alarming nearby enemies. It also had a new and highly advanced infrared camera that the pilots relied on for flying during the night. Story 18. That the US government from World War II to the mid-1970s funded an ESP project that involved using remote viewing to gather intelligence data. While information gathered by teams of remote viewers were found to be accurate, the US government denies that any of it was ever deemed useful for intelligence purposes. Yeah, there was a project to look into it, but just because the government funds something doesn't mean it actually works. Anything that came up as accurate was later concluded to be either an educated guess or an altered report. Keep in mind that this was an expensive program that people wanted to justify. Story 19. This is kind of related, but back in the 50s, the US, CIA, had a spy plane, U-2, that would fly on the edge of our atmosphere, around 70,000 feet. The pilot actually had to wear a spacesuit. It was thrusted into the public when the Russians shot one down in 1960. It just blows my mind that there are still countries in the world that have not come close to reaching space, but the CIA had a plane 60 years ago that could fly at the height, and it was completely secret. In 2013, they released a declassified packet of information explaining that Area 51 was largely used as a U-2 testing and pilot training ground. It makes me wonder what kind of crap they have now that is still kept secret. Story 20. Operation Downfall. It was the planned invasion of Japan by the USA in 1945 to end the war if the A-bombs were not used. It was declassified in the 1990s. I'm not saying using the A-bombs was correct or wrong, but looking at the projected deaths on both sides and the buildup before by both sides, World War I deaths would probably seem like a cakewalk in comparison to the expected. Story 21. Five Eyes and Echelon seem to be a pretty big surprise, even though they were declassified for quite a while by the time Snowden came around. Same with MK Ultra and Counterpol. Both of those have been public knowledge since the 70s. More recently, I'd venture to guess most people aren't aware of how active US Special Forces commanded in Africa is, and the fact we do have pre-insertion of teams to hit high-value targets, aka assassinate field commanders before actual combat begins. I mean, do people think Osama was the only one we have done something like that to? There's a reason they have been able to execute so well. Practice. Story 22. Not from the US government, but from their Korean ally, Bodo League Massacre. The South Korean government imprisoned up to 200,000 suspected communist sympathizers, and even people who had no connection at all but were added to fill a quota. At the start of the war, hindered them from doing covert operations. When the war looked lost, before the UN troops landed, they were all executed. That includes 12 to 14-year-old girls. The US, British, and Australian government were informed about this, but it was a secret in South Korea up to the 90s, and even today that's not something widely known. Story 23. Some people seem completely unaware of the violence and terrorism the US has been engaged in. They regularly arm and fund rebel/terrorist groups to destabilize regions and topple unfriendly government. Yet you are viewed as the crazy person for suggestion ISIS is yet another group on Americans' long list of rebel groups they supported. Story 24. The government intentionally irradiated populated areas of eastern Washington to study the effect and spread of airborne radioactive substances. The largest was known as the Green Run. There have been lawsuits since. Many people developed cancer as a result, but to my knowledge no trial has ever been allowed. Story 25. Two facts people still don't know about. Eugenics programs in America were running quietly up through the 1970s. In North Carolina, for instance, doctors were given a secret directive to sterilize young women coming in for abortions without their knowledge or consent. See here. Fact 2. Thousands of government experiments have taken place using children in orphanages, once again without their knowledge or consent. What better group to victimize? No parents or guardians looking out for their interests, and no one there to sue to stop it. See Russ Kick's 50 Things You're Not Supposed to Know to see the documentation. Story 26. This will probably get buried, but if you have ever heard from the phrase, "I cannot confirm nor deny," it has a pretty cool history. It stems from a secret mission code named Project Azorian, and the goal was to recover a sunk Russian submarine during the Cold War. Due to the Freedom of Information Act, the public wanted an answer as to what Project Azorian really was. The CIA did not want the Russians to know they did not find anything, but they couldn't lie to the public. Thus, the famous Glomar response was created, and has been used by politicians ever since. Story 27. A nuclear bomb almost detonated over North Carolina in 1961 after the B-52 carrying 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke up in mid-air. One of the bombs had gone through its entire arming sequence after hanging nose down when its parachute was caught in a tree. The arm/safe switch is the only part of the 6-step arming process that stopped the bomb from detonating. Story 28. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. If you ever visit Berlin, visit the Stasi Museum and take one of the tours. They have one in English daily. It's like 3 p.m. You hear/see some really chilling stuff and realize just how banal and horrifying surveillance state is. I try to ensure that everyone who visits me here goes to visit. It really has an effect on people. Story 29. Project Sunshine, where the U.S. government brought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Story 30. Project Pluto. A plan to make a nuclear-powered cruise missile that would fly around low to the ground, spewing radiation and leaving a massive sonic boom, carrying a payload of multiple nuclear bombs to drop on key targets. After dropping those, it would continue to fly around the countryside for weeks. Cancelled in the 60s, but the idea has recently been receiving new attention from both the Russians and Americans, if I recall correctly. Story 31. The Pentagon documents during the Vietnam War. I'd say they're more disgusting than terrifying, but a document leaked saying the war was unwinnable and the US was still present only to prevent a humiliating defeat. If I remember correctly, the document leaked in 1969 and the combat troops were in Vietnam till 1973, followed by the South Vietnam's collapsed in 1975. It's mostly terrifying because over 60,000 Americans were killed and an estimated 1 million Vietnamese, while halfway through the feds realized it was a lost cause but didn't stop. Story 32. Operation Paperclip. The U.S. brought Nazis into the U.S. after World War II to use them for their science expertise. Yes, they are responsible for bringing humankind to the moon, but they are also partially responsible for one of the darkest times in modern history. Story 33. Most shocking, heard it a few weeks ago. Before the Romanian Revolution in '89, the secret police, Securitate, was trained for years to encounter a massive Soviet invasion, like what happened in Czechoslovakia, by using guerrilla tactics, disinformation, and terror among the occupying forces. When the revolution broke out, it was thought that the country was infiltrated by the enemy in disguise, but the documents said there were no intervention of Magyar or Russian spies among protesters along all the protests. The army had been brought in, but when Ceausescu asked to open fire, the army refused. That's when the secret police, dressed in army clothes, started to open fire. Ceausescu had no intention to flee the country with his helicopter. He was preparing for a full-scale invasion, thinking Western or foreign forces are attacking the country. There was also a myth about Ion Ilescu, that he had been actually chosen by foreign forces, USSR and USA, to rule the country after Ceausescu's death, making the revolution into a coup. Also, I realized that the terrorists' panic was actually produced by the secret police that was implementing its strategy of guerrilla war and terror, being loyal to the communists at the very end. It is shocking because it explains why over 1,000 people died during the revolution, yet most of them happened in strange, short encounters with people dressed in black and using weapons the Romanian military did not have. Securitate also had the latest technologies in equipment and arms. Also realized the secret police had a secret magazine in which they could publish things they were interested in, like the latest methods to break a man with torture or the already mentioned plan in case the country was occupied by a force the army couldn't handle. Story 34. I remember something about a heart attack gun I read some time ago. Basically, a poison gun that once shot is untraceable in the victim's body and leaves no mark on their body. Sorry if it sounds really vague. It was a gun that fired a pellet made of ice that was coated with a special toxin made from shellfish. The pellet only left behind a tiny red mark on the skin that would be ignored since there was no blood. The toxin induced a heart attack and left no trace in the victim's blood. Story 35. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Basically, they made regular, average dudes, either inmates or prison guards, and observed the effects of giving someone a little bit of power and how that can snowball into some serious power tripping and abuse of power. Story 36. There's a huge collection of documents from Project Blue Book, which was a military investigation into UFOs from the 50s to the 60s. There's witness reports, photographs, and even a couple of film reels.